is the Cosmopolitan approach to Jewishness. That is, these are people from Jewish origins who are very assimilated, who feel like they are a citizen of world culture, but still see some kind of Jewish descent or background or identity. Some of them may not identify that way, and we might try to claim them, like Trotsky. Some may have rejected Jewish identity consciously. So one example is a movement called ethical culture. It was founded by a young man, a son of a rabbi, who was trained for the Reform rabbinate. He went to Germany to get his PhD, and when he did, he came back and was such a devotee of Kant that he said, I can't maintain any kind of Jewish identity anymore. In the end, for him, what was most important was the conclusions of philosophy and ethics. And so because he came from a Reform background that said there's no ethnicity anymore, all he had left was religion, and when he stopped the religion, there was nothing Jewish left for him. So somebody asked a question earlier, why didn't they take a next step after the Pittsburgh platform and just dump the religion? Exactly what Adler suggested they do. Mm-hmm. So in page 30 of your packet, you've got a piece by Adler. There's a short introduction explaining who he is. He rejected the theism of Judaism in a broad humanistic universalism. So here's a lecture that he gave, encouraging Reform Jews to either just become Unitarians or join the Ethical Culture Society. The leaders of the Reform Jews were anxious to find a warrant for the changes they considered necessary. They sought authority for their innovations. They endeavored to harmonize the old with the new. And cutting off what they deemed ephemeral and transitory, they were only the more solicitous to preserve the things which in their estimation were essential and fundamental in Judaism. Had they succeeded in so doing? And he points out that they dropped the rabbinical law, so they dropped the Talmud. They want to go back to the Bible, but the Bible isn't applicable to modern conditions. The authenticity of the books of Moses is doubted. There might never have been a law on Sinai. So all that's left in the hand of the reformers is the spirit of the Bible. And he says at the bottom of this paragraph, the spirit of the Bible is an elastic phrase which may mean a great deal or nothing at all. Among the Reform Jews, it means practically the belief in one God and the belief that the Jews were elected to be the standard bearers of monotheism. But in attempting to found Judaism on doctrine, the Reformers have departed entirely from the old basis, and their weak point is exposed because of the breaking down of their efforts. The basis of Judaism, according to Adler, is the law, just like Spinoza. The law. You drop the law, what's the point? And after all, what's distinctively Jewish about believing in one God and being a standard bearer for monotheism? You don't need to be distinctively Jewish for that. What you hear today sometimes is that Reform Judaism is summed up with ethical monotheism. Believe in one God, be a good person. Well, guess what? I know a lot of liberal Methodists who believe in one God and want to be a good person. Is there really that strong of a line between the groups? If you drop the ethnicity, if you drop the Jewishness, then maybe there is no line between the Reformed Jewish theology and other liberal theologies. It's just an accident of history and vocabulary. And so maybe it's not such a big deal between the two. And of course, the irony is that Adler's critique of Reform Judaism is the same as an Orthodox critique of Reform Judaism. Because the Orthodox would also say, it's all about the law and who are you to make changes. So sometimes, unfortunately, the secular critique reinforces a religious critique. So you get people in the atheist and humanist worlds who say, well, real Christians are the fundamentalists who believe every word of the Bible, and those liberals who are reinterpreting it, those aren't real Christians. I say, you sound like the fundamentalists you object to. Because they would also say those liberals reinterpreting are not real Christians. Whose side are you on here? So sometimes you have to decide how our rhetoric is played out. And I also included a rebuttal piece where somebody responds to Adler's critique. In the end, of course, there was a substantial population of Jews who felt like they were world citizens, but also maintained some kind of an affinity to the Jewish people. I think about people like Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud was absolutely a harsh critic of religion. I included a couple passages from his Future of an Illusion. You can even tell by the title, considering the religious belief in illusion. A searing critique of religious belief and lifestyle. And yet he was a member of B'nai B'rith. He identified as Jewish. He was persecuted as a Jew and had to flee Vienna at the end of his life because of his Jewishness. He wrote a book at the end of his life called Moses and Monotheism, exploring the origins of the Jewish people and Moses himself as a character and as a person, according to Freud. He was deeply committed to his Jewishness. And yet, he didn't identify with Jewish religion in any way. He was a world citizen. He didn't see his psychology as Jewish science, as the Nazis called it. He saw it as a science of humanity. It just so happened all of his patients were Jewish women in Vienna. But not all of them, but a large number of them were. And so the dilemma was, how do you identify someone like a Freud? And a former communist named Isaac Deutscher wrote a very interesting book. We have an excerpt of it in our anthology. It's on page 39 of your packet, called The Non-Jewish Jew. And he starts with the saying, a Jew who has sinned remains a Jew. And his own thinking is beyond the idea of sin or no sin. But it reminds him of a story he read about Meir and Elisha ben Avuya, Acher, that we talked about at the beginning of the day. And it tells the story of the rabbinic student walking next to his teacher, who was the heretic, and learning from him all the way. And finally, the heretic, Acher, says, go back, you've gone too far. Meir turns back, and the heretic rides on beyond the boundaries of Judaism. And so Deutscher remembers, and he asks the question, why did Meir, the leading light of orthodoxy, take his lesson from the heretic? My heart, it seems, was with the heretic. He appeared in Jewry and yet out of it. He had a respect for his orthodoxy, his students' orthodoxy, but he himself rode beyond the boundaries. And he began to wonder, what was his motivation? Why did he go so far? So the core point Deutscher makes at the bottom of this first page is, the Jewish heretic who transcends Jewry belongs to a Jewish tradition. He's a prototype of the great revolutionaries like Spinoza and Heine and Marx and Luxemburg and Trotsky and Freud. We already read, by the way, from Luxemburg, right? What did she say about being Jewish? I have no place for Jewish suffering. I have no special sympathy. Get me out of the ghetto, please. Trotsky as well rejected it. Heine converted out. Marx rejected it. Freud and Spinoza might have defined himself out of that too, right? Freud is the only one on this list who would have self-identified as Jewish. So Deutscher's trying to make the claims, what makes them Jewish? How can he place them in the Jewish tradition? They all went beyond the boundaries of Jewry. They all left. So that's a Jewish tradition. The holidays they aren't celebrating are Jewish holidays. They all found Jewry too narrow, too archaic, too constricting. They look for ideals and fulfillment beyond it. And they represent the sum and substance of much that is greatest in modern thought. The most profound upheavals taking place in philosophy, sociology, economics, and politics. What do they have in common? Well, what he argues later on in the book, and I think he touches on here, oh yes, he has it near the end. They lived on the margins, or in the nooks and crannies of their respective nations. Each of them was in society, and yet not in it. Of it, and yet not of it. It was this that enabled them to rise in thought above their societies, above their nations, strike out into wide new horizons. How can Freud see through the veneer of consciousness to the subconscious? Because he's already on the margins of European culture and he can see a new perspective. Einstein's relativity is a paradigm shift because he's beyond the boundaries and he can see new perspectives. Marx can see new versions of history because he's in and yet not in European culture. So this is the argument that the non-Jewish Jew, the heretic as a kind of Jewish tradition, is part of what facilitates Jewish genius, whatever that means. That enables Jews to see beyond the pieties of conventional society and actually be the revolutionaries in thought that bring great progress because they're in this marginal position. That's the argument.
So that would go along with the idea that the diaspora has actually been good. That this would go along with the idea that the diaspora has actually been good for the continuity of Jewish people. And I've read one or two books about that.
That's a different argument. I don't think that's what Deutscher is saying.
Okay.
He's saying it's been good for humanity. That this Jewish marginality contributes to human progress. I don't think he's talking particularly about Jewish survival in this case. That's a different argument.
I think is being used in the 18th century sense of inner spark, not creativity or special brilliance.
Right. But when we talk about the number of Jewish Nobel Prize winners, we tend to be using it more in the sense of genius and brilliance. I mean, why do we keep doing that? right? Why do we pay attention to famous Jews and successful Jews, scientists, Nobel Prize winners? What's going on?
Feels good.
Yeah. Again, it's the team. Who's on my team? I get Einstein on my team. I get.
That's like that Mel Brooks.
No, there's another reason for doing it, and that is to show how impoverished the world would have been if the Jews had been wiped out before all these people contributed to the fund knowledge.
So now here's a question. Do we get to claim them if they would have denied the claim?
Sure.
I don't know. And let me tell you why. Do you know who else would have claimed them as Jewish, even though they denied the claim?
Hitler.
Racial definitions of who is a Jew. They would have said that Einstein's math is Jewish math. It's Jewish physics. Freud's is Jewish science. And it's Jewish because there's something inherently Jewish about the person that he is, and it infects and taints everything that he does. I don't like that approach. I think Einstein can do just math.
That argument can't be taken seriously, except by extremists.
I don't, but that means that, okay, so if I'm an American Jewish writer, and I write a novel that has nothing to do with being Jewish, is it Jewish literature? If you insist that it is, then you're essentializing me as a Jew. You're ghettoizing me into Jewish literature and not letting me be just human, or just an American writer, or just an English language writer. So by claiming Einstein's physics as Jewish, I'm sure there's almost nothing, I can't imagine anything in his Jewish identity that led to the relativity theory.
But he was a Jewish human writer.
Well, that's different. If he's writing about ethics, if he's writing about morals, if he's writing about disarmament, that's a different question. That's where his values are influencing. But to claim that everything that he did is Jewish, I don't think is a sustainable position.
Well, who's claiming
all?
He came from a culture where learning and math was valued. He was valued.
Then how do we explain Max Planck? He's a non-Jewish physicist. How do we explain Tesla, Nikola Tesla, who made modern technology possible with electricity? How did he manage to see through the paradigm shift that was so different when he wasn't Jewish? He was
He
Italian.
didn't have to be Jewish, but
Copernicus is Polish. I mean,
the Jewish culture was an incubation.
not of scientific advancement.
Yes.
Talmudic culture. How many genius physicists are coming out of Brooklyn?
Well, it was and all of those people around him.
How about Ferber? He was Italian.
See, I think this is where it gets complicated when you're trying to claim scientific advancement as a Jewish product. Now, the contribution of Jewish individuals to the world, and they're getting beyond the ghetto, getting beyond the Talmud, and applying their minds to broader subjects, that's a different thing. It's an ethnic contribution.
That's where it makes
But trying to make the claim that Jewish culture particularly leads to this result, again, I ask you, where are the ultra-Orthodox physicists out there? They're not there. Yes?
Oh, I was going to say, I also feel like it speaks to this tension between the being separate and being included, and how much do you want to identify as being a Jew versus not. And, you know, I remember having conversations in my family, if we would see something on the news that someone Jewish did something bad, and like, oh my God, people are going to think that Jews, you know, like it's just and so it's, you know, you want to claim the Jews that are doing the good things, and you want to distance yourself from the Jews that are giving Jews a bad name. And you know,
There's a great short story. Other people do the same thing, that's true. There's a wonderful short story by Philip Roth called The Conversion of the Jews. If you haven't read it, it's definitely worth reading. And the story begins with a young child who, there's a plane crash, and his mom looks at the list of names in the paper and counts up the number of Jewish names that are on the list. And the kid says, I wish they were all Jews. And his mom takes him to the rabbi. He gets in trouble for that. What do you mean? You want more Jews to die? No. What he meant was, I want you to care about all of them as if they were all Jews. And it goes on in that direction where he has this more universal sentiment, and they read it as being anti-Jewish, but that's not what he's trying to say. So, yes, a couple last thoughts to move on.
All that stuff went on in my family too. Who's Jewish, who's not, what accomplishments. It seems as though I've grown up a little bit. It seems the line for me has been, does the person who had the accomplishment claim for themselves their Jewish history, culture, has some influence in their accomplishments? So like Lemony Snicket, children's author embraces some of that with the secular part, that means something to me. That person themselves sees the light of whatever their Jewish ancestry and upbringing is, whereas someone who disclaims it, why do I get the ability to claim it for myself?
Well, the other factor that's important to note here is, this was demonstrated to me by a woman author who asked the question, why am I always shelved in the bookstore in lesbian fiction? I'm American, I'm Jewish, I'm a woman, couldn't I be in women's literature or Jewish literature? Why is it always in the lesbian? Why does that take precedent? And the point is, in a modern society where you're not just shelving books in one part of the library, but you're in a hyperlinked world where it can be multiple things at the same time, that you don't have to choose one or the other. It can be a Jewish contribution and another contribution. It can be American literature. I mean, that's why now sometimes they teach Yiddish literature written in America in the American literature department. Just like Spanish literature written in America, it can be American literature. It doesn't have to only be by language. It's not only one category. So when we think about our roots from the cosmopolitan experience, we have to move on because we still haven't done anything on Zionism. Okay. We've only got an hour left. Okay. And we'll take a little break too. I just wanted to finalize by talking a little bit about what roots we get out of the cosmopolitan experience. First, as I said, this concept of having fuzzy boundaries, of being more than one thing at a time, of being Jewish and a universal citizen and politically active and so on. It's something we do all the time. And we also have to be careful of the cult of claiming famous people. So sometimes famous people say something on areas out of their expertise that are just woefully naive and wrong. And sometimes it's inspirational. I mean, there's a sports figure, Charles Barkley, recently, who advocated moving the NBA All-Star game out of North Carolina, given recent laws that were passed there. He's not a politician. That's not his area of expertise, but good for him for taking an important stand. At the same time, some of the quotes I read by Albert Einstein about the essence of Judaism, I say, oh, Albert. Stick to physics. Stick to math. I mean, Freud's Moses and monotheism is very creative, but it's not history. It's not archaeology. It's not sustainable. It's not believable. He should have stuck to what he knew. And so sometimes we have to be careful. If a famous person writes about their Judaism, but it isn't what they know, then we take it with a grain of salt. And certainly, their openness to the outside world, the impact of changing the outside world, that's something we value very strongly. But the last point is, for the cosmopolitan, it reinforces for us one more time that being Jewish is who you are. It's not what you believe. It may not even be what you do, but it's an essence of your connection to this people, culture, tradition, however you've defined it yourself. And I'm someone who's willing to say, if we allow people into being Jewish by choosing to be, then we have to allow them out if they choose not to be. It's a fair standard. And so if someone says, you know what, I was born Jewish, but I don't identify that way, I say, fine, that's your choice. He's of Jewish origin, but not Jewish. That's fine, that happens all the time. But if someone is of a different origin and chooses to be Jewish, then they're in. And that's the end of the conversation for me.